Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Mouthy Money podcast. I am joined as ever by my good colleague, Chris Tuite, who is head of consumer finance at pensions consultancy. Talking about pensions on the brain. Communications consultancy, MRM. There you go. I fluffed that again, Chris. We'll definitely get told off afterwards, but there we are.
Don't worry. I'm head of consumer finance at communications agency, MRM, and I don't know enough about my pension. So that's why I'm here, isn't it?
We are here to talk about pensions today, aside from my terrible podcasting abilities. We are joined by a really interesting guest, actually, Paul Budgen, who is co-founder of a business called My Time Pension. Now, Paul is a member of the, how was it you phrased it, Paul? The pensions
priesthood.
Pensions priesthood. Now, Paul has helped 8 million people into pension savings in the last decade. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, so before we dive into the topic today, which is, as you might have guessed already, about pensions, Paul, just give us a bit more background on yourself, who you are, where you come from, the kind of the classics.
So I would describe myself as an apprentice boy. I've had over 3 decades in the pensions industry. Originally from South London, I started my career in Kingswood in Surrey with Legal and General. I've been on my own in my startup for just over a year now, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we have our big launch early part next year.
And in the intervening period, you did work with one rather big pension provider. Is that right?
I've worked for lots of big pension providers.
Okay.
But I think relevance for this is I was director of business development at Nest when we had 2,000 members, and along that journey we kind of pivoted from looking at going direct and looking to go via IFAs to embracing payroll bureaus, payroll technology and accountants, and that paid enormous dividends. And when I left 5 years later, we had just under 7 million members. I think they're now up to about 11 million members. So a huge pension scheme in terms of numbers, relatively small AUM for the moment, but you can see that being 100 billion in the next 5 years quite happily.
Yeah. So Nest, we'll come back onto a little bit because it's quite an important part of the pensions market, shall we call it? It's kind of the backstop that small employers will use. So a lot of people who are listening may even have a Nest pension, depending on the kind of pension scheme that their company provides for them through something called auto enrollment. But we've got a bit more of we're going to inject a bit of jeopardy into pensions today and make things exciting. And we're starting that with Chris, with what you wanted to kind of to get into on it, aren't we?
Yeah, I'm turning this podcast into my own personal crusade to quell a lot of my personal finance panics. And when I listen, I've worked in financial services for 20 odd years, right? I know quite a lot about various products and what they do. But speaking entirely personally and being honest with the listeners and you guys here as well, when I think about my pension, I go into a bit of a panic. I do. I think there's just this overarching sense that I'm never going to be able to put in enough to get the kind of pot I need that means I don't end up living in absolute penury when I hit 65. And I want to speak to you good chaps, and particularly Paul, and just be like, how true is that? Because, I'm committed to the process. I've got 2 pensions, right? I've got my SIP and I've got my workplace pension. Workplace pensions putting stuff in. We mentioned recently in the podcast that I've revamped that and changed some funds around, and I found that an incredibly painful process, which maybe adds to this kind of panic. Am I doing the right thing? Why is it so difficult? Is someone trying to stop me? And then I've got my sort of Hargreaves pension, which is a SIP, which has a lot of funds within it, which I tend to kind of. It looks I'm contributing to it regularly. I'm rebalancing it regularly. But I'm not able to see a huge amount of growth at this point within it. And that to me makes me think, is this worth it? It seems to be kind of like bumping around up and down. So you think, well, I'm throwing this money in, it's moving a little bit. And if I look at the numbers from when I started to when I began, it's probably gone up just over a third, which is, decent growth. But when you get the projections through like my workplace pension provider, and it's not a lot of money. that they're talking about me retiring. It's certainly less than what experts like Paul would probably say that I should have. So I'm definitely at the point where I just need a little bit of a reassurance about what to do and what to think about. So, but Ed, you've got you're more relaxed, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a funny one. That I will start out by letting the listeners know that there is a very slight age gap between Chris and I. So, Chris, I've got
to tell. I know.
Obviously, we look so similar. I mean, there's only 5 years between us, right? But the thing is that that length
around listeners.
That length of time that you have to have your pension, slowly building. The earlier, I mean, we talk about this all the time. The earlier you start, the easier it is, kind of thing. And that's why you started, junior ISA when your child is 1 day old, because by the time they're 18, you'll have a decent pot there, and you wouldn't have had to put that much in it for them. I think my calculations are, well, let's say ambitious, and that is based on. So what I've put my pension in, and I'm going to say at this point, I'm going to give the disclaimer. Obviously, investing, it all carries risk, and you need to do the best research you can. And if you have any kind of, issues about it, especially if you've got a bigger pot, speak to an advisor, that kind of thing. Obviously, that's important. And I'm speaking from my perspective here. So what I did when I started my company scheme, when I joined the company, that was almost exactly 5 years ago now, is I put the whole thing in basically in a global index tracker. And that global index tracker, and I know that things are really ticking along at the moment, but that index tracker has done 17% a year, which is phenomenal growth. I mean, it's crazy good growth. And I don't expect that to play out forever. So if you make it a more conservative estimate, and I look at what I've got in my pot and I say 10%, I'm still looking like north of £1 million of a pot after 30 years. Take that down
huge figure, Ed. Really?
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
And take that down to 7%, and obviously that comes down a fair bit. And you take that down to and the thing that gets me is my pension provider provides me an annual estimate of how much they think my pension pot's going to have in it. And this year, I actually looked it up, and this year it told me that my final pension pot, it predicted it was going to be worth 170 grand when I retire at the age of 66 in 2055. That's over 30 years away, and it thinks that my pension growth is going to be 2% year on year.
This is the issue. I think this is the trap I've fallen into,
right?
Which is I get that and go, that's not going to be enough. So,
yeah.
I mean, first and foremost, why are we getting that? And I presume there's loads of good reasons why, but also it's kind of killing my spirit when it comes to doing this.
Yeah, actually, Paul, let's start with that as a point, right?
Yeah, Paul.
Why do pension schemes offer up these aggressively conservative estimates about what your pension's going to do in the future?
I mean, the quick and easy answer is their hands are tied by the regulator. The regulator says thou shalt produce a statutory money purchase illustration every year. I think it's worth, though, taking a step back and saying,
sure,
what are they really trying to do here? And ostensibly, if I'm being brutally honest, the only thing it really does is shows you the impact of charges. So you're in a insurance company, a company pension scheme, and you've got this illustration. It says you are being charged X. You then compare it to another one. You're being charged Y. You can see whether or not one is higher or lower, and whether or not you're getting value for money. Really, all those things do. It just enables you to compare one provider with another in respect of charges. That's all it really does. The regulator's in a bit of a no-win situation. If they over-egg the pudding, you're going to get a lot of frustration because you're not going to be able to meet those expectations. If you undercook it, you then get people questioning the validity of the whole thing. So, the regulator is on the side of the consumer, so they slightly undercook it, but enable you to compare one with the other, but it all roads lead to the FCA.
Yeah. So thinking about Chris's position on it and mine is,
Yeah.
where should we be landing? Should we be in this kind of middle ground where, actually you have more to be optimistic about than not? Am I being far too enthusiastic about my 17% annualized growth?
Yeah. You're being, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that's being very optimistic. I think rather than, I mean, the second you get a projection, the next day it's out of date. So it just isn't. It's a projection. It's what we think might happen in the future, and I'm a big fan of nudge theory, and I think there are some very quick and easy rules of thumb that I would teach in schools now, and the key one for me is 7%. So if you get 7% a year on your money, in 10 years that capital sum has doubled in value. Okay, I think most people can understand the 7%, and most people, when you understand compounding, the effect of compounding interest, can get their heads into that. And that's a really important one, because pension fund savings, about 50% of your final pot will come from the heavy lifting done by compound interest. So in the early years, you see a little bit of interest of investment growth, not a lot. But you joke about your age, I mean, you get to my age, and you see huge jumps in your pension pot because you've got a bigger bit, you've got a bigger pot to play with, but it's been invested for the last 30 years in my case. Now, I would make the point, this is not complicated. Anybody who tells you pensions are really, really complicated are usually trying to sell you an advisory service, right? It's not that complicated. Heavy lifting is done by compound interest. Therefore, the earlier you start, the better. Providing you get the 7%, you're going to double your money every 10 years. And if you start, dare I say it, when you were born, or you start when you were 18, you've got 40 years of growth there to produce a pot which will enable you to retire on relatively comfortably.
Yeah. Now before we kind of go too much further on it, do you want to just tell us a bit about your new business that you founded, My Time Pension?
Yeah.
Just what it is and what you're doing with it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big issues we have at the moment is that when folk come to take their benefits out of their pension savings, they don't know where to go or who to ask. And at the moment in the UK, it's very hard, almost impossible, for folk with less than £250,000 in their pot to get advice. The business model for advisors just means it's almost impossible to do. And because of that, lots of people are making some really bad decisions. They're paying far too much in tax. They're not investing it wisely, and ultimately going to run out of money. Well, that's where we come in. And I had a look at this market, and I thought, crikey, what do people want? And we boiled it down to create a sustainable income in retirement for me, and that was it. And so we now have an algorithm, we have a self-invested personal pension that enables not only to create that income, but because we do it in a 4 pots model, we produce 40% more income for about half the price, and at the same time give folk a little bit of cash so they can dip in, a rainy day fund, as well as a bit of money set aside for their family in terms of a legacy pot. And we put that all together in an app which folk can access, or they can go along to their advisor, who can have a quick word with them about whether or not they want to go down that option.
That 40% more income. How do you do that? How do you do that, Paul? How have you come to that? Because that's a huge difference, right? Life-changing in some ways.
So there's 2 ways of producing an income in retirement. One is buying an annuity. So you go to an insurance company, you hand your money over, they give it to you for the rest of your life. If you die early, it's put into an annuity pool, so you don't get anything back. The other one is drawdown, where you keep invested all through your retirement, and you just scoop off the yield. And a rule of thumb is about 4%. So when you're doing drawdown, and this is the comparison I had, your biggest payout is when you die. When you're, let's say, 90, if you live to 93, your biggest lump of money coming back will go into your estate because you're worried about running out of money. So you only take 4%. And the biggest monthly payout you have is the month before you die. Now, if you compare that to what I'm doing, I say retirement's not one thing, it's different phases. You've got your early years, 62 to 70, and you want to be more active. You've got your slower years, age 80, and then you've got your difficult years when you're kind of 92, 93. And I match that. But I know that because I want to buy an annuity at age 80, I can take a lot of that capital out and pay it to you in the early years. So in my example, if you had 100,000 and you did drawdown, you'll be returning something like £100,000 when you die. In my pot, you get £50,000 to your legacy because I've taken that 50,000 and I've enabled you to spend it in the early years. And because we do it that way, because we buy an annuity at later life when you should do, folk are able to get much more of their money out when they need it and when they can enjoy it in their earlier years of retirement.
So that's a really interesting distinction to make, because you do see retirement as, well, at this age anyway, as one sort of homogenous block.
Yeah,
obviously it's not a cliff edge, is it? It's not, that's it, you're retired now and you live on the same money until you die for the next 30 years. People are going to want to do different things. We're living longer. All those things are...
Well, let me just highlight that point. 1917, the monarch did something for the first time ever to do with longevity. Any ideas what it was?
Who was the monarch? Ed, you're good at history. Come on.
I get really stuck on my Edwards and Georges and things like that.
Can we phone a friend?
We won't phone a friend, but for the interest, this is not a history lesson, it's more a longevity lesson. The monarch sent a telegram to a citizen for achieving 100 years old.
Yeah.
And it was 1917, and the monarch sent out 12. So jump forward 100 years. So I think the numbers I use, I think it's about 2022. I think Her Majesty was still on the throne. How many messages? It wasn't a telegram anymore, but how many messages of congratulations?
How many WhatsApps did she send?
How many?
I would guess a couple thousand, maybe.
I'll say 1,000.
It was 250.
Oh.
Hold on. 250 a day. It was 10,500 people.
Wow.
Achieved 100 years old. So that gives you some idea as to how much longer people are living now. Mm-hmm. And the difference in the lifestyles, both cognitively and physically, at 100 compared to you can draw your benefits from 55 are worlds apart. So we need to stop thinking education, work, and retirement, and we need to start reinventing that into 5 or 6 different types of phases. I took a midlife sabbatical at age 50 for a year. People need to think differently about their retirement. Mm. 55 to 70 is different from 80 to 90, etc., etc. So hopefully that gives people some context.
Yeah, I think, I've got this thing in my head where I'm going to have to work till I'm 70, and I don't know why. That's just in my head. Maybe it's those projections.
But it's when it's the projections, but also it's a popular narrative. Person works all life, has a wonderful pension. It doesn't write headlines. Matt Maxwell does write headlines, and that kind of stuff, and Fear does. But I think there's a bit more. There's something a bit more insidious here, and that is, folk like to make these things really complicated, and they're not. They really aren't. As a rule of thumb, we've talked about the 7% rule, doubling your money. We talked about the merits of compounding interest. Whatever your pot is, at the when you come to retire, just think you're withdrawing 4% from it, maybe 5%. Gives you some idea as to the income that you're going to be living on.
Is that 4% a year, Paul? Sorry, just to be clear, or is that when you say 4% a year, right? Okay,
yeah. So if your pot's invested and you're getting that 7%, you've got a little bit in charges, you've got a little bit for inflation, and you've got a little bit for you. I mean, it's a rule of thumb. It's not financial advice. It's not a projection or anything like that. But just having these numbers in your head as a rule of thumb, I think takes a lot of the anxiety away.
So we need to change the title of this podcast definitely to "Reasons to be Hopeful About Your Pension."
Yeah, not pensions panic stricken, which is what I was going to start.
Well, Chris, because you like the media narratives that deal in fear, don't you?
I swallow media narratives for breakfast.
Such an optimist.
That's what I do. Just thinking about that, then. So, I'm really interested in the way you structure the retirement thing. But obviously, we're in this phase now where we're building that wealth, and so I'm thinking. I've got my rules of thumb that I'm going to double check now based on the numbers you've just given us. That's really helpful. But the other thing I'm thinking about is what happens the day I retire? What do I do? Who do I phone? What does someone drop me a line? Can you talk us through that process, Paul? Because I'm not entirely clear on what that looks like. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are.
Yeah, no, I again, I wouldn't look at it as a one moment in your lifetime. The time to really start looking at it is probably in your early 40s, and you're then planning what you're going to be doing over a next period of time. So I did hear one scary statistic that I think on average people spend 22 minutes deciding what pension product they're going to buy, and that could be set in stone for the next. Well, forever. If you're buying an annuity, I think, crikey, I spend more than 22 minutes trying to work out to get the Crystal Palace football ground, and I've been going there for 40 years. Just to kind of put that into context. So I would say start thinking about this. Get into the pension scheme. Put in as much. The 4 golden rules: join a pension scheme, put in as much money as you can. Keep an eye on the charges and get above inflation, and you will get to that 7%. You will double your money every 10 years. From the ages of, when you're in your early 40s, you then need to think about, well, what kind of lifestyle do I want to lead, and have I got enough money to support it? I would always say that probably the most important thing you need to do when you come to retire is get a full Monty medical. Really have a look at your longevity. Get your blood test done. It's going to say something like lose a bit of weight, don't drink as much, and it's going to say that. We know that, but really have a look at it, because some of the longevity stuff I think is quite interesting, and you can make some really small habitual changes that make a huge difference, and that's going to help you own that next phase of your life. So start the planning early. Think about health and wealth together. They are different sides of the same coin, and enjoy it. Play around with it. It's not that scary.
On that £250,000 pension pot figure, that's kind of the borderline of what we call the advice gap, right? Where it's kind of. And so I mean, what I find interesting about that, does that account for things like say I own my home as well, and it's worth £500,000, which is not that unusual these days. And but I don't have that much in a pension, probably because for argument's sake, I've focused on paying off a mortgage rather than getting into a pension pot. Are advisors looking at that and thinking, not really interested because you don't have a pot I can play with here, you've just got money tied up in a house, or what? How does that factor?
It's a good question. My answer is going to be a little bit political. It's kind of a little bit of both. I mean, a financial advisory firm is there to deliver financial advice. In order to do the job properly at retirement, it takes a certain amount of time, effort, and money to do that well. Now, you can write a check. Don't worry. You can say, "Here's £10,000, split or whatever the number is. Go and help me out." Or you've got a big enough pot where you can then take it out of the pot and pay the advisor that way. As a general rule of thumb, most advisors are going to struggle to do a really good job for you if you've got less than £250,000 in your pot and you're not prepared to write a cheque, which is 95% of people.
Yeah. I mean, part of the issue there is that, you know, so much of our wealth is bound up in things like effectively the property market, isn't it? And that, I mean, sorry, go on.
You say that, but I think that's maybe for now, but I don't think that's for my kids. My kids are 20 and 22. They're now joining pension schemes. I mean, they come in for Bank of Mum and Bank of Dad actually for deposits on houses. But I think the buying property and using that as a kind of, my property is my pension line has gone for folk of that age, and they'll probably get my parents' inheritance more than anything to give them that step up, or I pay out my resources, and that's slightly different. But don't forget, about 10 years before automatic enrolment, we had something called stakeholder pensions, and stakeholder pensions was meant to revolutionise the pensions world, and it did absolutely nothing because it wasn't compulsory. So folk. Maybe a bit. I'm 52, so folk in their mid-40s decided not to go into the pension scheme, but put all their money into property. I'm being very generalistic here, but there are folk who are a few years younger than me that have relatively small pension pots, but have huge housing equity as a consequence of that. And this is a really good example of how clunky government policy can drive behaviour that doesn't necessarily end up with good outcomes. And I would suggest a good outcome we want is engaged people who are managing their assets in order to do things like house themselves, make sure that they're healthy and they've got enough wealth to live on.
Yeah, I mean, I think my view of it on property is I'm happy to pay a mortgage because it means I'm not paying the mortgage of a landlord effectively, but I don't want it to be the egg in which I put all, the basket in which I put all my eggs, shall we say? I
totally agree with that. I think the best risk tool you have is diversification. So you have money in pension, you have money in ISAs, maybe some stocks and shares, housing, blah blah blah, and you have this broad-based approach towards it.
And that diversification, I mean, it works in more ways than just kind of the market structure of how things perform over time, doesn't it? Because, and as we've seen in the recent budget, which I was possibly just going to ask you about, is we've seen the tax treatment of things change over time, right? And that suddenly makes things less favourable. Like for instance, and in the budget, we've had a change in the inheritance tax treatment of pensions, which is going to have a knock-on effect.
Huge.
Because I mean, and I'm going to ask you for your view on that, but as far as I understand it, pensions for a long time people have been told use your pension last because that means you can then just pass it on, and the IHT is not going to comfort you. Do you think that's going to change now? People are going to start bringing their pensions forward and actually using them more proactively.
No, they will. I mean, were there some very wealthy individuals putting a lot of money into pensions for IHT purposes only? Yes, there were, but it was a very, very small percentage. The general rule of thumb for financial planning was run down your ISAs, keep as much money into your pension scheme, and then when you come to take an income out of your pension scheme, just take a little bit of it out because you get a bit of tax-free cash and a bit of income, and you draw it down that way because it's outside of your estate before the age of 75. So happy days. A lot of folk are now having to rethink that and think, well, actually, do I want to take 25% out of my pension and give it to the kids so that they can, or in my case, I'm going to lend it to them, but give it to the kids.
At a competitive rate of interest.
More out of the clutches of any errant partner they might have who then decides that, I could have half of So I see I see a lot of advisors now having to revisit their clients' files and decide, well, we need to rethink this income strategy in light of IHT stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that this is the thing that scares me about pensions, and it's not the fact, that whether I may or may not have more enough in my pension when I retire, because as I said earlier, I'm relatively positive about that. The thing that scares me about pensions is this stuff at the end, not at the end, but when you hit retirement and you start having to make those decisions.
Yeah.
That's what's scary for me.
No, and there is no reason to be scared about it. I do think there's a lot of people that make a lot of money from making you scared, because then you can go to them for help and advice. There is a fantastic paper written by an academic called Michael Johnson. There are two Michael Johnsons, don't get them confused. And one of them makes the point quite eloquently that what people should be following is the model that we're employing, the four pots model. But he goes one step further and says it should be the default option. And I think this is really interesting. We like nudge theory. We like behavioral psychology. You cannot have worked at Nest and not be a devotee of it. It's worked extremely well in automatic enrolment. We need to replicate that on the way out. The tricky bit is our regulatory environment is either advice or non-advice. Now, the bit in between is guidance and targeted support, and we could do some magnificent things with just targeted support. People like you do this. You could do this. You could do that. This is the outcomes or potential outcomes. And I go back to, there's three ways of working. There's do it with me, do it for me, or do it yourself. Do it yourself. Overwhelmingly, the research shows that people get it wrong. Do it for me, that's the advisory model, but you have to have 250 grand. So I want to do that bit in between, which is do it with me. There's just folk who understand the basics. That's great. They just need a little bit of help and a little bit of the heavy lifting to be taken off their shoulders, and kind of 4 clicks and done. And that's what I want to do. And I think there's a huge market for that. I really do.
Do we know how many people potentially could be helped by something like that then, Paul?
Yeah, well, if you look at the FCA numbers of their last recent report, there's 140,000 people, about 13 billion quid, come onto the market every year. 50% of them do it themselves. And I don't think they do it themselves for particularly great reasons. They do it themselves because they can't get help. So you would say there's 70,000 people out there screaming for help, as well as the 20,000 that encash the whole thing. You encash the whole thing, you pay about 100% more tax. That's nuts. That really is crazy. And the irony is, a lot of those folk are very happy. Suddenly they've got £50,000 in their bank account they didn't have before. They don't really care that they paid £40,000 in tax. It's the biggest amount of money they've ever had. But inflation, running out of money, blah, 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 that would all kick in the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. So it's a terrible, if I am asked by the FCA to think about, through Consumer Duty, good member outcome, if I went to the FCA and said, I'm going to allow everyone to cash out, pay a load of tax and run out of money, they'd be going, are you insane? We're never going to sign that off.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think as well quite interesting is a discussion between ISAs and pensions, because obviously that's the scary thing with pensions, is all the tax implications at the end of it. Whereas you take the hit early on with the ISA, but then it's yours forever. No one's going to touch it. That kind of thing. It's
a good shout. And the only thing I would say is, for high rate taxpayers, pensions is a no-brainer, because you get the tax relief on the way in. If you do a bit of salary exchange, talk nicely to your employer, say, look, you're saving all this employer national insurance contributions. Can you put it into my pension contribution? If you do, I work with a financial advisor where I live, and 2 or 3 customers have come in and they cannot believe the amount of tax relief that's on the table for them as high rate taxpayers. So I think, as general rule of thumb, again, high rate taxpayers, the relief you get on pensions going in are well worth it. I do acknowledge that ISAs are great for, you can get your money out quite quickly, and they are exempt. But I still go, do your pension allowance first. I have your emergency fund, but do your pension allowance first.
Yeah. The drawback with the ISA is just sacrificing a bit of growth at the start. It's that extra 20% in the pot to
or 40% if you're higher.
Or 40%, to be invested,
between
isn't it?
100 and 120,000 pounds, you effectively got a tax rate of 60% because you lose the personal allowance. So if you took that, it is a no-brainer. In fact, if anything, you could potentially, as an advisor, you could put yourself in a dodgy position if you didn't recommend it.
Interesting.
So, Paul, we're learning a lot about retirement. I feel calmer. But obviously, in terms of my time, because obviously, if listeners want to sort of start thinking about that, what stage are you guys at? Can people sign up to you?
We've got a website, My Time Pension. You can sign up. We do regular updates and releases. We're on LinkedIn, so folk can have a look at that. We're at MVP stage, so we are 1 week away of having a minimum viable proposition. Sorry, I told me not to use jargon. We are in the FCA application process. We're in the FCA innovation pathway. I'm talking to them about the use of AI within our product as well. Touch wood, early next year we will be launching our early adopters program, so getting the first 100 customers in, and with a view of then going to market. For your listeners who I think are probably a wee bit of a way off, you've got to be 55 before you can draw your benefits down. The key message really is we're going for this new way of doing stuff, which is work with you. We want to do targeted support. We want to do guidance. I don't believe this stuff is particularly hard, so I make it really easy, give you a framework in which you can work through. So don't panic. We've got you. Just do your bit now. Put the money in, and then let's have another conversation when you get to age 55.
So 8 million people helped into pension savings so far, and then hopefully a few more coming down the line.
Hopefully, yeah.
Well, I think that just about covers everything we need to do. I was going to ask you where people go, but we've sorted that out. Really interesting discussion. I think, we want to help people not be scared of their pensions anymore, and also to not ignore them, because I think actually paying attention to them is also ultimately quite important.
Lean into it, own it. You use the rules of thumb. I think you'd be surprised actually how easy it is. I
certainly am. After the projections Ed was giving earlier, might be able to retire to the Bahamas or something. I don't know. Anyway, there we
go. Is that a beach near Brighton?
Yes,
Brighton,
Eastbourne. Sorry, I meant Eastbourne, not the Bahamas. Anyway, there we go.
Brilliant. Paul, thank you so much for joining us, and Chris, thanks as ever for being my domitable co-host.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for listening as usual, and we will catch you all again next week, when I believe we have a very special Christmas edition that you won't want to miss. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube. You can also follow all our latest updates on TikTok, Instagram, or X. Finally, check out all our money stories on the Mouthy Money website and subscribe to our weekly newsletter for all the latest straight to your inbox. Thank you and goodbye.